So one of the larger issues, particularly when it comes to long-term leases, is who is responsible for the operating expenses of the property. Um, Both the tenant and the landlord want to know or want to define who pays for expenses and especially who accepts the risk of expense increases, i.e. inflation. And again, this is a bigger deal when it comes to long-term leases. So there are a couple of different lease styles that address who basically is responsible for inflation risk or for more specifically the increase in operating expenses. So we will start with talking about a gross lease, then we'll go to a modified gross lease, a net lease, a triple net lease, a double net lease, and then a triple net lease. And as we go down this spectrum, the landlord becomes less responsible for operating expenses until we get to triple net lease, where the tenant is solely responsible for operating expenses. So on the gross, the majority of the risk is with the landlord. On the triple net lease, the majority of the risk is with the tenant. All right, this is a visualization from the tenant's perspective of the risk of operating expense increases. So we'll start over here on the left-hand side. With a gross lease, there is absolutely no risk to the tenant for operating expense increases because the landlord is solely responsible for paying the property's expenses. Now, if we slide over to a modified gross lease, the tenant is responsible for everything over and above a stop amount. And so a stop amount typically is what the expense for the expense amount at the date of the lease, the first day of the lease. So to give you an example, if real estate taxes were $100, what the landlord is saying is, hey, I will pay the real estate taxes up to $100, but anything over 100, that's the stop amount, is $100. Anything over 100, then you, the tenant, are responsible for that. Okay, so they go down and they do that for all the expenses. They establish stop amounts, and the tenant is responsible for anything over and above those stop amounts. Now, the next type of lease is just it's what called a single net lease, and the tenant has risk specifically to property taxes. So if property taxes were to increase, then or the property taxes are paid by the tenant. The landlord covers everything else. If we go down even further to a double net lease, the tenant is responsible for only the property taxes and insurance. The landlord covers everything else. And then there's a thing called a triple net lease or an absolute triple net lease, and all the operating expenses are responsible for being paid by the tenant. Now, the tenant and the landlord understand that there is risk incorporated in being responsible for paying the expenses. So oftentimes you can be in a market and have a property, and it'll be the same landlord and tenant negotiating, but they will get vastly different amounts. The rent rate will be vastly different amounts based upon who is operating, who pays the expenses. So they might be saying, hey, listen, if you want a gross lease style, then you're going to be you owe $10 per month. But if you are willing to be responsible for the operating expenses, we think the operating expenses may be about $3 per square foot. So to make that equivalent to the $10 gross lease, your triple net lease will be $7. So the tenant would pay $7 to the landlord, but they'd be responsible for the expenses, which they've calculated to be about $3 per square foot, which would make the tenant sort of indifferent to whether they had a gross lease at 10 or a triple net lease, but being responsible for the operating expenses at $7. So in general terms, it's always best to read the actual lease before you model a property's cash flows, because you are going to need to know who's responsible for expenses. You'll need to make predictions as to what the inflation rate is for expenses, and that will affect your value of your property. So in the case where tenants are responsible for the operating expenses, there are a couple different payment schemes that landlords will use. The first is that the tenant is responsible for the expenses no matter what. The landlord and the tenant agree that, hey, the tenant will just make those payments. You'll receive the bill for, let's just say, taxes and insurance. You'll just pay those directly to the company. So that's one way. That's paying directly. The second, and oftentimes this is used, is that the tenant will reimburse the landlord. So there are a couple of expenses, in particular, property taxes and insurance, that if those payments are not made, there's a potential that the owner could lose the property. So the landlord are very, very cautious about making those payments. So typically, what they prefer to do is they say, "Listen, we will pay, we will physically write the check to pay for the real estate taxes and insurance. I'm going to hand you, the tenant, the bill, and you have to reimburse me for that." So if that's the case, reimbursements typically show up on an income statement, or if you're going to pro forma a building that has this, will show up in the income section as expense reimbursement revenue, but they will also show up in the operating expenses. So again, as our example, if I'm a landlord and I absolutely want to make sure that my property taxes are paid, but I'm going to have my tenant reimburse me, those property taxes will show up two places. The first place they'll show up is in the income line, or an income section, which basically says expense reimbursement or property tax reimbursement. But then they will also show up under the expense in the expense category as property taxes. So if tenants are responsible for some of the expenses, the calculation is fairly easy if there's just one tenant in the building. It's a single tenant property. But when you get multiple tenants in the property, then you have to do some sort of allocation of those expenses among the tenants. So in retail, generally, the expenses are prorated based upon the gross leasable area, or the GLA, of the store as a percentage of the GLA of the entire center. So if I have a store that has 10,000 square feet of GLA, and the entire property is 100,000, I would just take the ratio of 10,000 over 100,000, and that's the percentage that specific tenant would be responsible for the expenses. Now, in an office and a multi-tenant industrial property, typically it's the same calculation, but it's prorated based upon the tenant's rentable area. And this includes what are called common areas, or CAM, C-A-M, common area maintenance. And you can think of a common area as if you walk into a mall, where basically the hallways that people walk down to and from the stores. Maybe there's a children's playground. There's a seating area. So nobody rents that space specifically, but there is expense to maintaining it, heating it, cleaning it up, providing lights for those areas. And those expenses are what are called CAM expenses, or common area maintenance. And you have to make sure that those, as a landlord, are included in your expenses that you have the tenants reimburse you for. So we introduced this concept a couple of slides ago, but just as a recap for the modified gross lease style and the concept of expense stops. So basically, the tenants pay a gross amount of rent, and the landlord uses some of this rent to pay expenses. However, if the expenses increase past a certain amount, which again is established at the beginning of the lease, it's called a stop amount, the tenant is responsible for the additional amount for the expenses over and above the stop amount. So the landlord assumes responsibility for the expenses up to the stop amount, and then anything over and above the stop amount, the tenant is responsible for. Now, typically, you'll see modified gross leases in office property types. Every once in a while, they'll show up in maybe an industrial or retail, but typically, this is an office property type lease style. So let's go over a numerical example of how a modified gross and expense stop actually works. So let's assume that the owner recovers all operating expenses from the tenant except for management fees and admin expenses. Let's assume that the total building's rentable area is 60,000 square feet. The total recoverable operating expenses are 400,000, which is basically $6.67 per square foot in a year. And tenant A's rentable area is 6,200 square feet and has an expense stop of $5 per square foot. So here's what the expense exposure to the tenant looks like. So the owner is going to recover $10,354. And the way you get that is that the tenant has 6,200 square feet of rentable area, and they are going to be basically responsible for the difference between the stop amount, which is 5, and what the actual expenses came in, which is $6.67. So if you take 6,200 times them by $1.67, you add it to the rent, you should get the 10,354. Now, this is a graphical representation of the risk or the expenses that the tenant pays. So all the way up to $5, which is the stop amount, the tenant pays nothing. As soon as those expenses go past $5 per square foot, it's a dollar for dollar increase. The tenant is responsible for those expenses. Now, if a new tenant were to come in right after this 1 year where expenses came in at $6.67, most likely when that new lease was negotiated with a new tenant, they would say, okay, listen, we're okay to have a modified gross lease, but right now expenses are $6.67. We want our new expense stop to be $6.67 as well. All right, well, let's talk about a different rent style. It's something unique typically to the retail property type. So talk about stores that sell things in malls or strip centers, anything retail. And it's called a percentage rent lease. So in the retail field, the percentage lease has become the most popular rental contract for both tenant and landlord. It establishes minimum tenant lease payments and provides upside to the landlord for exceptional performance. So in shopping centers, the most common type of percentage lease is one in which the tenant agrees to pay a specific minimum rent plus a percentage of gross sales over a certain amount. Now, if you notice, by having a percentage rent lease, your tenant and your landlord's interests are greater aligned, because what it's saying is that, hey, listen, if the tenant does really, really well in their sales, then both the tenant and the landlord benefit. And this incentivizes, or should incentivize, the landlord to select tenants that help all foot traffic in that retail area increase. And through greater foot traffic, all the tenants should sell more. And when they sell more, they have more sales, and it's the landlord will experience a greater income because they're getting a percentage of those increases. So specifically, the percentage lease balances the tenant and the landlord's interest. Again, it brings it into better alignment. The preferred lease format is triple net. In addition to a base rent plus overage if included, the tenant pays its prorated share of real estate taxes, insurance, and maintenance. Any percentage rent paid over the base rent is called overage rent. So continuing on with percentage rent, this lease style is a structure used to better align landlord and tenant interest. In exchange for a lower fixed base rent, the tenant agrees to pay a certain percentage in rent whenever its store's sales exceed a threshold. This incentivizes the landlord to choose a site's tenant mix in a manner that increases foot traffic, maintain proper signage, advertise, and tenant stores with complementary products or services. This lease structure benefits the tenants because their fixed base rent is lower than without a percentage rent, and the rent increases will be conditional upon the success of their business. Percentage rent leases can also benefit landlords by giving them an equity-like return. However, for this to be executed successfully, tenants must usually provide monthly sales reports and financial statements upon request. And oftentimes this is difficult, particularly when you get to smaller tenants who aren't sophisticated or don't want to pay for an audited annual payment. Oftentimes the retail space that my family owns, what we do, we recognize that a lot of our tenants are small and don't want to pay for this. We in the lease write an option that basically says once a year with the option to basically bring in an auditor and to audit your sales to make sure that the numbers that you're providing us are what an audited financial statement would calculate. And we hope that that sort of keeps all of the tenants sort of honest. So in a percentage rent, your total rent that you pay, you have a base rent, and then you have the percentage rent or the overage rent.